Welcome to Frequency. I'm Chuck Gose. Well, and there's no Jenni Field this week. Frequency is your go-to for real talk about comms, culture, and employee experience beyond the buzzwords and straight to what matters. When Jenni and I first launched Frequency, we were committing ourselves to doing weekly episodes. And when Jenni's international travel got in the way, we thought, well, let's just see if we can do this on my own. So here we are. It's going to be a lot of America all the time. And I don't know if that's a good thing, but let's get into our articles for this week. We're going to talk about Cracker Barrel doing the unthinkable. No, not changing their logo, but expecting employees to eat at Cracker Barrel. Why connecting with the front line is so critical, and exploring the irony of HR being lost in its own career path. But first, we're going to kick things off with Uber. Uber CEO Dara Khosrowshahi went on the Daria CEO podcast and said the quiet part out loud. He expects employees to respond to his weekend emails immediately, doesn't talk about work-life balance at all at Uber, and if you can't keep up with the pace, quote, "We're going to push you out." He frames this not as toxic hustle culture, but as a philosophy about hard work being the great equalizer, a skill that anyone can develop regardless of what they studied. The nuance he offers is that flexibility and hard work aren't mutually exclusive. He's quote unquote religious about family dinner from 6 to 8 p.m., but by 9:30 p.m., he's back on email and he starts at 5:30 a.m. What a lovely schedule. He positions it as a personal choice, not a mandate others must mirror exactly. Still, when the CEO sends emails on Saturday and expects immediate responses, calling that flexibility is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Let's contrast that to Lanier CEO Kari Saarinen has deliberately built a remote-first culture around 40-hour weeks and quality over quantity. Both companies are credible. Both leaders are intentional. The question for those in employee experience isn't which CEO is right. It's whether employees at either company actually know what they're signing up for. What this shows is there's this tension between I respect your personal time and reply to my Saturday emails immediately. That is very real. So how should employees handle leadership messaging that contains that type of contradiction? Well, there's something generally honest about naming culture explicitly. That's something Jenni and I have talked quite a bit about on the podcast. And research shows that little less than half of workers say that workaholic tendencies are driven by employer expectations or company culture. At least that Uber CEO is being transparent about what his culture is, rather than some kind of unspoken norms doing the damage somewhat quietly. So these high clarity environments can sometimes reduce a particular kind of burnout, kind of that ambiguity-driven exhaustion. And purpose and expectation clarity are consistently among the top burnout protectors in the data. However, some other data that shows 85% of workers receive after-hour messages at least a few times a month, and 60% get them weekly or more. 3 in 5 respond out of fear for not doing so would actually hurt their career. So when a CEO says, you're not fitting the culture, that's not exactly how fear-based compliance gets created. And McKinsey found that about 2/3 of employees feel burned out at least once a week. In 2025, that's up about 20 percentage points since 2023. Now, I don't know how people feel burned out once a week and then recover, because we know that burnout recovery, true meaningful burnout recovery, can take anywhere from 3 to 6 months to recover from. So I don't know how I feel about this. Now, I'm not a big work-life balance person. I don't agree it's possible because both sides want more than you can give. I guess what I look for is a little work-life flexibility, knowing that sometimes work is going to demand more, so you have to give up some of the life side of it, and other times life needs more, so you have to give up some of the work part of it. So the problem is you've got CEOs like this who are saying, I don't expect you to do this, but this is what I'm doing, and I want you to model this behavior. And to his line, you will be pushed out if you don't model that. That's not a very inclusive culture, and certainly not one that is going to prevent burnout from a lot of people. So I would expect, I'm not surprised, I guess, by this response. If you listen to this podcast, you know I'm pretty critical of leadership behavior. So I'm not surprised by this. I guess what I appreciate is the transparency of it. You know what you're signing up for. if you go to work at Uber. Next up, we have Cracker Barrel is doing something what every struggling company does: cutting costs and kind of hoping nobody notices. A leaked internal memo first reported by the Wall Street Journal instructs employees to eat at Cracker Barrel restaurants for all or the majority of meals when traveling on business. Alcohol is off the expense report unless a senior leader pre-approves an exception. I'd like to know how those conversations go. The company has since clarified that the eat at Cracker Barrel part isn't new. It's been policy since June of 2024, so still kind of new, but not brand new. But the alcohol clampdown is brand new, and the leaked memo made the whole thing very public. The backdrop also matters a bit with Cracker Barrel. They've been a bit of a mess lately. The failed 2025 logo redesign reportedly cost the company $100 million in market value before they reversed course and brought back the old-timer logo. Declining foot traffic slowed revenue and internal restructuring. Instructing road-tripping employees to eat biscuits and gravy, chicken fried steak. That doesn't sound awful to me at their own chain. Does feel like a bit of a cost control measure, but also a bit of a workplace story. A policy that existed quietly for 2 years only became a controversy because it leaked without any context. Now let's go to Cracker Barrel's clarification on this. It's not new. And quote unquote, they can still eat at other places. That landed flat precisely because the company let a leaked memo define the story first. The communication failure here isn't the policy, it's the absence of proactive framing. Whereas the Uber CEO, he's stating it publicly. Now, me personally, I actually don't have a problem with this. I think the leaked part is the interesting element here. So when an internal policy leaks and goes viral, what responsibility does the company have or the comms team have, and how do you respond to that? Because for me, this policy is pretty unremarkable. I guess if I worked at a Cracker Barrel, or I worked at McDonald's, or I worked for Hilton, and I was traveling, I would expect to spend the company's money at those places. So if I work at Cracker Barrel, of course I would eat at Cracker Barrel. If I work for Hilton, of course I would stay at a Hilton. So that to me isn't a big deal. In fact, SAP Concur coined the term travel scrimping in their 2025 Global Business Travel Survey to describe exactly this trend: tighter reimbursement, meal limits. So Cracker Barrel here isn't an outlier. They're just the one whose memo leaked. And also the fact that this has existed since June of 2024, I'm surprised it took that long to get out there. The only change was the alcohol restriction, which I've worked for companies in the past that would not let you expense alcohol. I don't see that as overly controversial. Alcohol is not a requirement. Eating meals is a requirement. Alcohol is not one. So if that's part of the culture, I don't see that that's honestly that big a deal. I think the reason this got so much attention is because of that reverse major rebrand that they had, where they lost all that market value. Even that was a big thing about nothing. All companies change their logos all the time. The fact that that turned political is what thrusted, I believe, this back into the marketplace. So why did this get leaked? Why is this a big deal? I honestly don't know. But I think it shows the response that you have to it. If Cracker Barrel had come back and been like, of course we want our employees to eat at our restaurants. This is the benefit we get out of that. This is the benefit they get out of that. And also, yeah, we don't want to buy people's booze. Again, not a big deal, but some people made it a big deal. Next up, we're going to talk about my favorite audience, which is the frontline workforce. Former United Airlines CEO Oscar Munoz gets credited with turning around a famously miserable airline workforce, 85,000 employees, deeply disgruntled, and bleeding discontent into the customer experience. His framework was very simple and uncomfortable. He built the turnaround around, quote, the guy with the wrench. When a mechanical issue delays the flight, it's not the middle managers who fix it. How motivated the mechanic is, how much discretionary effort he applies in that moment, determines whether the plane gets out, whether the crew makes their next assignment, and whether the airline hits its on-time metrics. Everything cascades from that one person. This is on an article in Fortune written by Stacy Holt-Zara, layers in some interesting data. 2025 WorkVivo survey, something Jenni and I talked about in a previous episode, found 87% of frontline workers are unsure whether company culture even applies to them. Nearly 9 out of 10 are unsure whether that culture applies to them. 42% say leadership isn't good at communicating with them. 69% want to be better at understanding company strategy and what it means for their role. That's the nugget right there. A June 2025 Aspen Institute study found US GDP would be 10% higher if the essential economy had kept pace with white-collar productivity growth. I've never liked the white-collar, blue-collar, so I'm just quoting this here. From 2015 to 2023, white-collar productivity rose 28%, while essential economy productivity actually declined. The Howe Institute adds another layer. 94% of employees say moral leadership is more important than ever. That's amazing. Again, I like that they're holding them to the standard, but only 6% of CEOs and 9% of managers deliver it. Munez's quote lands well right here. Quote, "In today's polarized times, the concept of consistency is the real courage." Now, this is the core argument everyone should be having inside their organizations. We know that culture isn't a perk. It's not something on a poster, though sometimes we need to be reminded of it. It's that operating system that determines whether the person holding the wrench, that frontline employee, gives you their best effort or the minimum effort. Munez's quote stands out because, again, he was known for showing up. There is video and photos of him pulling up a chair and listening to people. That's a very physical, visible response to that frontline feedback. So how scalable is that approach? Easily scalable. It all comes down to leadership, taking the time and making the time to make that happen. We know there's so much knowledge with those frontline employees or that essential workforce that's a part of every organization out there. So whether it's Munez or others, this makes a difference. Now, I want to go back to that Howe Institute number. About 94% of employees believing moral leadership is more important than ever, but only 6% of CEOs deliver it. If that is true, let's say that it is, the problem isn't that leaders don't know this matters. It's that the incentive structures actually don't reward it. That's a much harder conversation to have than just show up to the floor. So we need leaders to deliver on that moral leadership the way that employees say it is so important. And we're going to wrap up here with a new survey from the HR Certification Institute covering thousands of HR practitioners. They found that 26% of respondents have no clear career path. And another 41% say they have some sense of direction, but it's not well defined. And more than half looked for another job in the past year. 41% are considering leaving HR entirely. The function that designs these career frameworks for organizations and succession plans and leadership pipelines for everyone else apparently hasn't done the work for itself. The article names a few structural reasons this happens. One, HR teams are often too lean. I think a lot of organizations or a lot of departments would say they are also lean, but especially at many mid-sized companies, there might just be one HR director, one chief people officer, which means the ladder simply doesn't have enough rungs. Again, not a unique problem to HR, but still can be frustrating. There's early career roles and payroll benefits and compliance that build some operational depth, but not always that consultative credibility needed to become a true HR business partner. And because HR's impact, much like comms, much like employee experience, can be harder to quantify than sales or operations, promotions can feel very subjective, reinforcing the perception that this path forward is not clear at all. Now, we talked about burnout earlier. Burnout shows up here too. Since 2020, I do think we have to acknowledge HR absorbed the pandemic, all the return to office battles, all the layoff, the social justice responses, all those things hit them, often without adequate support or headcount. People analytics is flagged as a bright spot. Data fluency is increasingly differentiating HR leaders who can connect workforce trends to business outcomes. That's a longer-term fix for something that looks more like a bit of an immediate crisis. Now, reading through this in the study, the irony is almost too easy. HR doesn't have clear career path for its own people. So is the irony the actual problem, or is it a symptom of something deeper about how organizations value the function? So let's go back to some of those earlier numbers here. The numbers might be a bit worse than they look when you stick a quarter of HR practitioners have no career path, 41% have a vague sense. That's roughly 2/3 operating in this career ambiguity, in the same function responsible for career clarity for everyone else. That's more an indictment than it is ironic. And the structural problem that they have is not a mindset, it is architectural. Like lean teams, organizations are getting flatter, these subjective promotions. You can't create upward mobility that doesn't exist, and you can't expect HR practitioners to build a T-shaped skill set that doesn't solve a problem if the next rung only opens up when someone leaves. Again, not unique to HR, but I think this speaks a lot to those challenges. Now, going to that people analytics part too, as a career differentiator, that's typically probably only going to be at very large, data mature organizations, but it is accessible to maybe the top 15, 20% of HR practitioners. What I've seen is most mid-market HR teams don't have the data infrastructure to support a true people analytics role. So it's not a realistic answer unless those same people who are those 2/3 that are in this career ambiguity leave. So HR not unique in having that limited scope, limited, or I should say unclear career path, but this is proving to be a bit endemic in the organizations. And so what can they do about it? Well, we need to recognize, how can HR get their own version of that guy with the wrench, the Munoz thing, the United Airlines thing that we talked about earlier? How do we showcase the being essential to the operation and not excluded in conversations about their own futures? Well, that wraps up the content I did this week. A lot of me talking. Jenni will be back next week, but I do want to share my freak out. We always end every episode with that. You've heard me talk about this on other episodes in the past. My freak out is the X Factor Summit. So if you are listening to this on Monday, March 23rd, when the episode comes out, I will be facilitating the very first X Factor Summit at Transform. This has been something that has been in the works for what looked initially a couple years, but my partner in life and work, Kristen Hancock, also pointed out to me back on May 11th, 2019, we initially scoped out this X Factor Summit. It took a while for us to get here, many years, 2,508 days, in fact, to pull it off. So I want to thank the Transform and the Transform community for supporting us hosting the X Factor Summit at Transform this year, bringing communicators to this new experience, bringing communicators into this larger employee experience conversation. 6+ years in the work. We're finally here. If you're listening to this on Monday, I'll be mid-effort leading this X Factor Summit and then going into the rest of the event. So thank you to everyone for supporting Icology at this year's Transform event. And thank all of you for joining us this week. All the articles that have inspired this conversation are in the show notes. And please don't forget to rate and review after you've listened. Subscribe so you don't miss another episode, and pass this along to someone you think would enjoy listening or watching. You can also find Frequency on YouTube. Thank you to my dear friend Poet Ali for contributing music to the show. We're back every Monday with more news, insights, and opinions about everything comms and leadership in workplaces today. Keep tuning in and turning up.